Isaiah chapter 14 this morning. We spoke last week about how from chapters 13 to 23 we're dealing with burdens. We're dealing with judgments on surrounding nations, nations that surround Israel and Judah. These burdens are not directly addressed to Judah and Israel. These are addressed to the other nations. And so we started chapter 13, and we read through chapter 13 last week, which is a burden for Babylon. And we're going to continue discussing Babylon this morning. So in chapter 14, beginning in verse 1, it says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. And the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids. And they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. And it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow, and from thy fear, and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve, that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, How hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked, and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he is that ruled the nations in anger, and is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest, and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, Since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. All they shall speak, and shall say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy viols. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." And that's as far as we're going to read in Isaiah chapter 14 this morning. I'm afraid that if we tried to pick up the rest of the chapter, we would end up running over, and to prevent that, we'll just stick with these 15 verses, and we'll go from there. So, again, as we said earlier, we're continuing on with our discussion of Babylon and the burden of Babylon, which is the judgment. And we said last week that there are in these chapters, chapters 13 through 23, when dealing with all these burdens, things that have been fulfilled and things that are yet to be fulfilled. And so when people study through this passage, they sometimes get confused. They sometimes mix things up, and to be honest, they sometimes, I think, ignore the truth of Scripture. So we'll see that as we go through here. In verse 1 it says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob." So if you remember, when we study, and we have studied, and Ron has went through the book of Nehemiah, and we've studied through the books of Haggai and Zechariah, and we've studied through the book of Ezra, we know that they go back to that land from Babylon after they're taken into captivity. This is before, Isaiah is prophesying well before they're ever taken into captivity. Isaiah lived at the time of King Hezekiah, before Babylon was ever even an enemy of the people of Israel and the people of Judah. They might have been a secret enemy, but they, if you remember, they had sent an envoy, and they were visiting, and King Hezekiah, in the 15-year time span that God had given him after he was supposed to have died, he really messed up there, and he showed these Babylonians all of these great wonders and treasures and things that they had for the Lord. And these Babylonians went home and said, look at we saw all these grand things. At some point, we need to go take that land. It's going to be ours. We want it. And so that's the beginning of the conflict with Israel and Babylon, Judah and Babylon. But it says here that the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. They hadn't been taken out of their land yet. The people of Judah hadn't. And Isaiah dealt primarily with the people of Judah. So it says, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. I don't know, just studying through Scripture and studying history, I've never seen anywhere where the strangers were joined with them when they were in their land worshiping God. Now, they did have, they did keep for them as servants, I believe it was the Gibeonites. And they had a few different people groups that lived there in the land along with them. But when they went through in the book of Joshua, for the most part, they destroyed a lot of the people in that land. There were some Canaanites left over. There were some that were pushed out into Moab and Ammon. There were some that were pushed up to the north. There were some that were pushed down to the south. But for the most part, the Jews owned that land. They had claimed and established themselves in that land, as was their inheritance. So I don't really know of any time where the strangers were actually joined with them. Maybe it's referring to one of those little small people groups that lived there in the land with them. I personally believe that it could be, but the main idea is that there will come a point in time when the Jews will possess the land, and the nations that are surrounding them will actually be truly joined with them, and that will be the millennial kingdom. That definitely isn't now. You can say, well, he brought them back to their land in 1947 and 1948, and they're there. Well, I'm telling you what, the strangers aren't joined with them. Not even close. Whenever they were allowed to go back after they were escaped, or after they were set free from the Babylonian captivity, the strangers sure weren't joined with them. You had those, I believe it was Sanballat and Tobiah. They were these, Sennacherib was the king of Assyria. But you had these people, you had Sanballat and you had Tobiah, and you had all these people that for generations had just gone up against them, tried to prevent them from building, tried to prevent them from establishing themselves, establishing farmland and establishing a means to provide food for themselves. They wanted them to remain dependent upon their captors, upon their governors, and that wasn't God's plan. God's plan in eventuality is for them to rule, and He will rule, and they will be the nation through which He does His ruling. So it says in verse 2, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and for handmaids, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. And that exactly right there says, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place. We've read about that already, how what's going to happen at the end of the tribulation period is all these Gentiles are going to realize who exactly God is. They're going to see, and they're going to say, okay, we need to take these Jews back to their home, and they're going to they're going to take them back, and they're going to be right there with them, and they're going to worship God along with the Jews in that land. And it says, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were. So these people are going to become servants. They're going to become subordinates. It says, and they shall rule over their oppressors. And Babylon is fated to that just like any other nation. Any opposing nation, any surrounding nation, any surrounding people group, whether it be Chaldeans, whether it be Medes, whether it be Ammonites, whether it be Moabites, Edomites, they're all going to be overthrown. It says, and it shall come to pass, in verse 3, and it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve, that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. And so, again, what I want to remind you of is this is talking about the actual historical nation of Babylon, but there are also references, there are also doctrines in here meant to tie to Mystery Babylon, which shows up in the book of Revelation. And so Mystery Babylon will be the oppressor. Mystery Babylon will be the golden city. We're not going to go read it in the book of Revelation this morning, but I'll just tell you, if you want, you can read Revelation 17, 18, 19, 20. You can read all four of those chapters and you can see what I'm talking about. Mystery Babylon was a great economic powerhouse of the tribulation. It was, it's described as, the great whore, the great harlot, because it was, the city just sold itself. If a city had a soul, this city sold its soul during the tribulation period for economic and political influence and gain, for materiality's sake, for materialism, not for God. Didn't devote itself to God. The people in that city did not devote themselves to serving the Lord, did not devote themselves to studying His Word, did not devote themselves to spreading His gospel. They devoted themselves to the exact opposite, to complete and whole service of their own stomachs and their own lusts. And that was what that city was. And you might as well look at it as that's how historical Babylon was, partially, and that's how Mystery Babylon will be. Except I think that Babylon in the future is many times further removed into sin and debauchery and evil than even the original Babylon. It's going to be far, far worse. And that could bring you in the discussion, how if they're sinning, how can one be worse than the other? How can you say that this one's going to be worse than the other? Well, it doesn't take very much common sense and reading of Scripture to understand that there are different judgments and different punishments for different sins. Just because something is, it is true, sin is sin. It's all equally intolerable to God. The smallest sin, whatever you want to say it is deserving of hell. For the wages of sin is death. That's what it gets you. But we know that God regards some sins as abominations. We know that God specifically calls out and hates certain sins even more than others. Pride is a sin that God really hates. We're not going to get too deep into that, but you do have the ability as a Christian with knowledge of the Scriptures to be able to say one thing is worse than another. It's not necessarily equally bad because you know that certain things are worse than the other. That doesn't mean it's better to be in one lesser sin. There's no such thing as being better. There's just things that are worse than others. So, in verse 5, the Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. And so, I believe this here is more specifically directed at the Mystery Babylon of the future than it is at the historical Babylon, because we see that the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. When Babylon is destroyed, whenever it's taken over, whether you're talking about when the Medes take it over, whether you're talking about when Alexander the Great comes through, whether you're talking about when the Jews eventually rise up under the Maccabees and gain their independence once again from the Babylonians, regardless of whatever you're talking about in this, throughout history, there was no point in time where the whole earth was at rest, and there was no point in time where the whole earth broke forth into singing over the destruction of just one nation. Babylon had allies. Babylon had people that would that stood to gain from the existence of Babylon, and when it was destroyed, they stood to lose at the destruction of Babylon. So I don't believe that this verse is discussing something that has already happened. I believe that it's speaking of something that is yet to happen. It says in verse 8, "Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, Since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us." And so, at this time, when Babylon was in power, and after Babylon had been taken out, a lot of these trees had already been cut down. Babylon used a lot of the resources from Lebanon, a lot of the resources from that surrounding area, and they took it. And they took those things. They made the land bare in a lot of ways. And just as it was starting to grow back, that's when the Romans decided it was their time to take over the land. So at no point, since really the Babylonian takeover would this actually be something that has been fulfilled? Because those great forests with those great trees and those great resources, they don't exist now. They aren't there. And so it says, "Since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us." We know that can't be talking about historical Babylon. It can't be, because we know the Romans did exactly the same thing. The Romans pillaged any resources they could whenever they came through and conquered the land, and they set up their own province there for their empire. And so this has not yet been fulfilled. We've spoken many times at this point, especially when studying through the book of Zechariah, that the land itself will be restored. Not only the people will be restored, but the very land itself. And what does that mean? It means that it will become a fertile area. And we've discussed how the mountains that are surrounding Judah, and specifically the mountains around Jerusalem, a lot of those will be flattened. And we're not going to go through and look through the entire book of Zechariah and see all the ways that land is going to be restored and blessed. But if you just read the latter half of the book of Zechariah, as we've studied through it, you can see how many of those things will come to pass. That Jesus himself will be involved in the restoration of the land. And my personal belief, we discussed it when we studied through the book of Zechariah, my personal belief is that the 12 apostles, discounting Judas Iscariot, because he was never actually made a true apostle. He was one of the original 12 disciples, but at the time when they received their commission, at the Great Commission, he was not there. He was not present. And so I believe those apostles will also be present and will be assisting. They're going to be ruling in the millennial period. They're going to be there in the millennial kingdom. They'll be with us whenever we're with Jesus, whenever he returns, whenever he comes back with his hosts. We'll be part of those hosts. We'll be there. And they're going to be there too. And I believe they'll have significant leadership there, but I believe they'll be involved when Jesus is there. It doesn't say anything about us going back to heaven for a short period of time, before, while he's setting up the kingdom. Once he brings us with him, we're there. And so I believe that includes the 12, and when he's restoring the land and flattening those mountains, whenever he told them that if you have faith as a mustard seed, as you can remove this mountain, I think that that's going to be literally fulfilled at that time, that they're going to be involved in the restoration of the land. I don't know why not. Peter walked on water. It was through the power of Jesus, through the power of God, but if he can do that at the time with as little faith as he would have had at that time, if he can do that, then who knows what will be possible whenever Jesus is on earth reigning, setting up his kingdom and executing God's will to bring order and peace to the earth. I think it's going to be an amazing time that as much as heaven is unfathomable, I think that this millennial kingdom is still, we've seen a lot there's way more descriptions about the millennial kingdom than about the realm of heaven itself. At least heaven as it exists now. We know there will be a new heaven and a new earth. But as it exists now, the third heaven, the one that I believe Paul saw, as unfathomable as it is, I think that the millennial kingdom will also be unfathomable. Even with all the descriptions we're given of it, even with all the imagery we have from Scripture, we can't imagine the glory and the wonder and just just how amazing that it will be to live on earth and reign with Christ as joint heirs. I think it will just be, it's beyond words. So, but these forests, these cedars and the fir trees, they're not there now. And so I don't believe this has yet been fulfilled. It says in verse 9, "Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations." And you can say that about historical Babylon. You can say that. You can say that they were welcomed into hell because they were not God's people. They did not believe God. They did not believe His word. They did not follow the law. They did not only did they not follow the law, they had no faith to follow the law. They didn't meet any of the requirements in the Old Testament that you would need to meet, whether as a Jew or a Gentile. They did not meet those. They had not experienced salvation. They were not heaven-bound individuals. They were hell-bound individuals. And it was a hell-bound nation. And so you can say that about historical Babylon, and I believe you can also say this same thing about Mystery Babylon in the future. It says in verse 10, "And they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy viols. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee." And so, I'll go ahead and read verse 12. I think I can make the point I want to make even after reading it. It says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" So, we see here the reference to Lucifer, which I believe is a clear reference to Satan. And we'll discuss that in some detail here in just a minute. But I want to, with that in mind, I want you to think about verses 9 through 11, how hell is moved to meet them at their coming, and how those that are there say, "All they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy viols. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee." I believe this is a reference to historical Babylon. I think that it is discussing, that God is speaking to Satan through historical Babylon. In the same way, and you can look in, I believe it's either chapter 28, we'll just confirm that here while I'm thinking about it. This is something we've also discussed before. I believe it's Ezekiel chapter 28. We're not going to read all the verses there. But in that chapter, you see that Satan is addressed as God is addressing the nation of Tyre, or as it's listed here, Tyrus in Ezekiel chapter 28. And we'll just read a couple verses here. Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 13, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, the gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee." And so God here is speaking through Satan, or speaking to Satan through the king of Tyre, which is one of the Canaanite cities. It's one of these last remaining cities that the Canaanites still owned. It was part of the Phoenician empire. It was a seafaring city, similar to Sidon, and those two cities were very closely related. But God here was speaking to Satan through Tyre, and I believe you can see how he does that through Egypt in other portions of Scripture, such as in the book of Daniel, and I believe you can see how he's speaking, to to Satan here through Babylon. So something that did historically and that is historically true, that has been fulfilled, God is equating that with something that's going to happen to Satan in the future. Now I want to discuss this because it says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer," this is verse 12, "son of the morning, how art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" And so I have known people to try to use this verse as the sole proof that, for the original source material for Satan being cast out of heaven for the first time. When sin was originally found in him, this is when he was cast out of heaven. Well, what does it say here? "How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" We know Satan was in the garden. Go back and read the first few chapters of Genesis, and then also look at Ezekiel chapter 28 like we just did. It said there he was in the Garden of Eden, and he had all those wonderful stones arraying his appearance originally. What nations existed before the Garden of Eden that he could have weakened? There weren't any. Unless it's talking about some kind of angelic nations in heaven, which I don't believe would be the case, because that's something that we don't see from anywhere. There's no other scriptural backing to make that claim. This is something this is the discussion of something that will occur in the future. It says in verse 13, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will also sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north." That is something that Satan did want to do. When sin was originally found in him, that was his goal. It is still his goal during the tribulation. We've talked before, and Ron just studied about Abaddon in the book of Revelation this past week. And then there's also we've talked at length about the Antichrist. And I believe I've discussed this before multiple times, that in the tribulation, Satan tries to set up, he tries to arrange, in order to be the most like God that he can be, a satanic trinity. He tries to form his own trinity. Now, it's not the same as God, which is actually, one God, three wills, three personages, three personalities. Three beings in one. It's not exactly that, because they're still three separate beings, but Satan tries to make it like it's three beings in one. He exists, the Antichrist exists, and then this angel that comes from the pit, Abaddon, Apollyon, that means destruction or perdition. Judas is also called the son of perdition. We see those three beings. We see Satan the Father, which is himself actually, Satan the Son, which is the Antichrist, and we see Satan the unclean spirit, which is this Abaddon who is subservient, he's subordinate to Satan. And that's, I believe, the appearing of the satanic trinity there, when Abaddon is released from that pit, that Satan, he completes his trinity. Now, I will say that doesn't mean that God is out of control because Satan now has this trinity. Not even close, because you see that the judgments that God unleashed in the tribulation period, he allowed Abaddon, or Apollyon, whichever name you want to give, he allowed that to happen. He is responsible for the unlocking of that pit and allowing that whatever thing, creature, demonic, angelic being to be released from there as judgment. God's in control. He allowed it to happen. And what's going to happen when that judgment's over? It's going to be sealed back up. No problem. No issue. No sweat. It's not it's not as if it was bound because God had a hard time with it. That's not the case. It was bound because that was its fate, to be bound, just like it will be Satan's fate to be bound for 1,000 years and then let loose for a season and then eventually sent into hell in the lake of fire. That's just how it's going to happen. That's God's program. I didn't write it. He did. And if you wonder why he does things a certain way, well, why does this have to happen in order for this to happen? Well, why does it work this way and not this way? We can ask him that by and by. We don't need to worry about that now. What we need to do is have faith have faith in Jesus Christ. We need to have faith in the Word of God. We need to have faith in his returning. And we need to be looking forward to his appearing. I don't want to miss out on that crown. That's the easiest to get. I want to get that one. At the very least, I want that one. Because I'm looking forward to him coming back. But we see here, back into Isaiah chapter 14, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" And so, that son of the morning, and Lucifer basically means a bearer of light or a shining one, which shouldn't be, new or confusing to anybody if you look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14. It says, "And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light." Because he wants to appear like God. He wants to appear as if he is pure. He wants to appear bright. He wants to appear as a shining one because he wants to fool people into going with him. It's a game of deception. It's not his true nature. His true nature is a murderer. His true nature is a liar, and he is the father of it. So it says in verse 14, and this is again Lucifer or Satan's attitude, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." So he wants to sit also up on the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. He wants to ascend above the heights of the clouds and be like the Most High. And Ron talked about this last week. It was either last week or it wasn't very long ago, about the sides of the north. Well, if you look at Job chapter 26, verse 7. Job 26, verse 7. This is Job speaking with Bildad, his friend, and he's giving a parable. But he's speaking about God here, and it says in verse 7, "He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing." Now, while you're considering that, I'll turn over to Psalm chapter 48 and read verse 2. It says, "Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." Now, what is that? What does that mean? The north, or the sides of the north, or stretching out the north? Well, north is used in the Bible in two ways. It's used, one, in the way that we commonly understand the word to be used, when we think about a compass rose, when we think about the four directions, the four major directions, north, south, east, west. It's also used to mean up. If you would have asked a Jewish person, about the sides of the north, that's referring to up there, the sky, something that's beyond what we can see. They believed God was in the sides of the north, was up there. We believe the same thing. When we think of heaven, we think, well, it's up there. We have that same concept. We talk about going up to heaven and going down to hell. It's the same idea. It's up. Now, if you want to think about, like it says here in Job chapter 26, 26 and verse 7, he stretcheth out the north over the empty place and hangeth the earth upon nothing. If you want to think about heaven, I don't know about heaven, like what the actual physical relationship is of heaven to the structure of the universe, because what they say is the universe is always constantly expanding, but it also has no boundary. What basically, I guess the idea is that God's just continually stretching it out and stretching it out and stretching it out and stretching it out. But then where is heaven in relation to the universe? Because angels, while they may not be beings like us, they can have a physical presence. And so that means that if they exist in heaven with their physical presence, then heaven also must be a physical place. It's just not, it's just not within the confines of the universe. I don't pretend to know what I'm talking about when I'm saying all this. So this is just the way I've kind of thought about it. If the universe truly does have no true boundary that we can actually measure, is heaven on one side of the universe? It is on another side of the universe? Is it on the other side? Where's it at? Or is heaven? I don't know if heaven's all around this. You could think about that for a really long time and you wouldn't ever come up with an answer. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But the idea is that if that were the case, then heaven wouldn't necessarily just be up. You point that way and it'd be that way. You could point that way and it'd also be there. You could point down and you go all the way through out to the other end of the earth and keep going down for all eternity, and eventually somewhere there is heaven. I don't know that it's actually that simple. It's beyond my feeble human capability of understanding. So again, I don't pretend to know the answer, but I think what we have and what's being used here in Scripture and the way we think about it as if it's just up, that's good enough. So, but Satan, or as it said here, Lucifer, which I think is maybe more specifically a reference to the Antichrist, since he'll be the person, the person in charge of the kingdom. He'll be the person in charge during the tribulation. Of course, Satan is in charge of him, but he'll be the person there, the human. That's what his goal is. And that's been Satan's goal all along, is to take God's place, to become like the Most High, actually to become God himself, to usurp his authority and run it just exactly the way he wants to run it, to make it his show. And so I will send above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. And so we see here in Daniel chapter 11, verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. The idea that we have here is that this Antichrist person, it says here in Daniel chapter 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. This is something we've talked about before. I believe the Antichrist will be somebody who is descended either from, most likely from a Jewish lineage. And he won't regard God. It says, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold. He'll honor Satan instead of the one true God. He'll honor the one true faker. And when he does that is his motivation. That is his, that's his fuel for trying to ascend above the heights of the clouds and be like the Most High. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I know what exactly or how exactly the Antichrist attempts to do this, but I do believe that the Antichrist is going to try to attempt to actually go to heaven, with Satan's power and try to start some kind of war. I don't know exactly whether there's going to be some kind of space program or whether it's just going to be some satanic power that we don't understand or fathom, or what's exactly going to happen. But I do believe that Satan and the Antichrist, or some combination of Satan and the Antichrist and Abaddon, that unclean spirit, Abaddon, will try to make an assault on heaven, and they'll fail, and that'll be it for them. I don't know exactly what the timeline is on that, how far along it will be in the tribulation, how long it takes for them to get knocked down and then Jesus to come back. I don't even think that they'll get all the way, I don't believe they'll actually even make it to heaven. But I believe they're going to try. They're going to do something. Because I don't see anywhere where it talks about Satan being in heaven prior to the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're there in heaven with Jesus, and I don't believe that Satan's going to intrude on that. So, there's going to be an attempt, at the very least, during that 7-year period. I don't know how far they get, but they're going to try something. Not saying that because it's some kind of warning that, well, whenever you're there with Jesus, you need to worry about this happening because it's a possibility. No, that's not it. I'm just trying to just give you the full, group of information. I don't even want to say facts because this is just the way I understand it. So that's the way I see it, that they're going to try to pull this trick and do something, but it's ultimately going to be unsuccessful, just like every other thing that Satan has done throughout all history against God. It's going to end up being unsuccessful. So, it says in verse 15, "Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell to the sides of the pit." So instead of making it to the sides of the north, he's going to make it to the sides of the pit. And that's where he'll spend all eternity. That is the final resting place. And so there's a lesson to be learned there because, we see that Babylon, historical Babylon and both mystery Babylon, end up in hell in this place where all these other nations that went against God ended up. You don't go against God and win. That is not a game plan. That there's no hope. There's no victory. You do not go against God and win. So that's one reason I'm glad to be saved. I'm glad to be on His side. I'm not going to, I don't always do everything perfectly. I mess a lot of things up, and in that sense, I'm going against Him when I sin, in the same way that everybody else is. When we sin, we're going against God. But I thank Him that's all forgiven, because I don't want to be against Him. I want to be on His side. I don't want to be a loser. I want to be a winner. So that's all this morning. That's Isaiah chapter 14, verses 1 to 15. Any questions or comments this morning?